June 6th, 1944, a date that would forever be etched into the annals of human history. A day when 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel to storm the beaches of Normandy, France. A day that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's grip on Western Europe. This is the story of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. Before we dive into the blood-soaked beaches and the thunder of naval bombardment, we need to understand how the Allies arrived at this moment. By 1944, the war in Europe had been raging for nearly 5 years. Hitler's Germany had conquered most of continental Europe, from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow. Britain stood defiant but exhausted, having endured years of bombing and isolation. The Soviet Union, after initially reeling from the German onslaught in 1941, had begun pushing back against the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, but at a staggering cost in human life. The Americans had entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and by 1942, Stalin was demanding that the Western Allies open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army. Churchill and Roosevelt understood the necessity, but they also understood the magnitude of such an undertaking. An invasion of Nazi-occupied France wouldn't just be difficult. It would be the most complex military operation ever attempted. The strategic planning for what would become D-Day began in earnest in 1943. At the Casablanca Conference in January of that year, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed that Germany must be defeated through a combination of strategic bombing, support for the Soviet offensive in the East, and eventually an invasion of Western Europe. But where and when? Initially, the Allies considered several options. Some argued for an invasion through Norway, others through the Balkans, which Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. But ultimately, military planners concluded that a cross-channel invasion into France was the most direct route to the heart of Germany. The question then became, where exactly in France should they land? The obvious choice might have been Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, just 20 miles across. The Germans certainly thought so. Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, and the defenses at Pas de Calais were the strongest of all. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox who had been given command of defending the French coast, concentrated his best troops and most formidable obstacles there. But this was precisely why the Allied planners, led by British General Frederick Morgan, chose Normandy instead. The beaches there were less heavily fortified, and the Cotentin Peninsula would provide the Allies with access to the crucial port of Cherbourg. The plan was given a code name, Operation Overlord. The actual invasion would be called Operation Neptune. In December 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower, known as Ike to his friends, was not the most brilliant tactician in the Allied arsenal, but he possessed something equally valuable: the ability to manage massive coalitions of forces from different nations, with different commanders who often had massive egos and conflicting ideas about how to win the war. He would need every ounce of that diplomatic skill in the months ahead. Under Eisenhower's command, British General Bernard Montgomery was given control of all ground forces for the initial phase of the invasion. Montgomery, known as Monty, was confident to the point of arrogance, but he was also meticulous and had a track record of success, particularly at the Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory commanded the air forces, while Admiral Bertram Ramsay oversaw the naval operations. This was a truly Allied effort, with American, British, Canadian, and forces from occupied nations all working toward a common goal. The scale of preparation was almost incomprehensible. Southern England became one enormous military camp. Millions of tons of supplies were stockpiled. Thousands of aircraft were assembled. A fleet larger than any ever gathered in human history was being prepared. Special equipment had to be designed and built. The Allies developed artificial harbors called mulberries, which could be towed across the channel and assembled on the Normandy coast to facilitate the rapid unloading of supplies and reinforcements. They created Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, to pump fuel directly from England to France. They modified tanks to clear mines, breach obstacles, and lay bridges. Perhaps most importantly, they developed an elaborate deception plan called Operation Fortitude. The goal was to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy, and to keep them believing this even after the Normandy landings had begun. The Allies created an entire fictitious army group, the 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, and positioned in southeastern England opposite Pas de Calais. They built dummy tanks, trucks, and landing craft. They generated false radio traffic. They even had double agents feed misinformation to German intelligence. The deception worked brilliantly. Hitler and his high command remained convinced that Normandy would be a diversion, and that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. This belief would have crucial consequences on June 6th and the days that followed. But while the Allies were preparing, so were the Germans. Rommel understood that the invasion, when it came, would have to be stopped on these beaches. Once the Allies established a foothold and began pouring in reinforcements and supplies, the Germans would be fighting a losing battle of attrition. He famously said that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be the longest day, and that Germany's fate would be decided in that crucial period. Rommel worked tirelessly to strengthen the Atlantic Wall in Normandy. He ordered the placement of millions of mines on the beaches and in the waters offshore. He had massive steel and concrete obstacles installed on the beaches to destroy landing craft. He ordered Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles stuck in fields to prevent glider landings. He flooded low-lying areas behind the beaches to slow any Allied advance. And he positioned his forces as close to the coast as possible, arguing that reserves held farther inland would be unable to reach the battle in time due to Allied air superiority. But Rommel faced opposition from his superiors. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, believed the invasion should be met with a mobile defense, with panzer divisions held in reserve to counterattack once the Allies had revealed their intentions. The disagreement was never fully resolved, resulting in a compromise that satisfied neither commander and left German forces neither concentrated on the beaches nor positioned for a decisive counterattack. Hitler himself complicated matters further. He kept personal control over the panzer reserves, meaning they couldn't be committed to battle without his direct approval. And Hitler liked to sleep late. This seemingly minor detail would prove significant on June 6th. As spring turned to early summer in 1944, the invasion force was ready. Over 2 million Allied soldiers were in Britain, with 156,000 designated for the initial assault. The plan called for landings on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. From west to east, the Americans would assault Utah and Omaha beaches, while the British would land at Golden Sword beaches, with the Canadians at Juno Beach in between. The beaches themselves were just code names, chosen to maintain secrecy, but they would become immortalized by the events of June 6th. Eisenhower had originally scheduled the invasion for June 5th, but the weather had to be just right. They needed low tide so the German beach obstacles would be visible to the engineers tasked with destroying them. They needed a full moon for the airborne operations that would precede the beach landings. And they needed decent weather, calm seas, and clear skies. But in early June, the weather over the English Channel was terrible. Storms battered the coast, and Eisenhower was forced to postpone the invasion by 24 hours. The decision was agonizing. Tens of thousands of men were already loaded onto ships, seasick and anxious. The window for the right tidal and lunar conditions would close soon, and the next opportunity wouldn't come for weeks. Every day of delay meant more risk that the Germans would discover the true invasion site. It meant more time for German defenses to improve. It meant prolonging the war and potentially allowing the Soviets to advance farther into Europe. On the evening of June 4th, Eisenhower met with his top commanders and his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg. Stagg delivered cautiously optimistic news. There would be a break in the weather on June 6th. It wouldn't be perfect conditions, but it would be enough. The question hung in the air. Should they go? Eisenhower polled his commanders. Montgomery was in favor. Lee Mallory was concerned about the airborne operations and poor visibility, but didn't object. Ramsey said the Navy could do it. Eisenhower sat silently for a moment, the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. Then he spoke. "Okay, we'll go." The die was cast. Operation Overlord would commence on June 6, 1944. As darkness fell on June 5th, the vast invasion fleet began moving across the English Channel. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft, from massive battleships to small landing craft, formed convoys and headed for France. Overhead, more than 11,000 aircraft filled the skies. Bombers headed to strike German positions. Fighters flew escort and prepared to strafe enemy defenses, and hundreds of transport aircraft and gliders carried the airborne troops who would be the first to land in France. The airborne assault was a crucial component of the invasion plan. The mission was to secure the flanks of the beach landings, capture key bridges and causeways, and disrupt German communications and reinforcements. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were assigned to jump near Utah Beach on the western flank, while the British 6th Airborne Division would land east of Sword Beach. Shortly after midnight on June 6th, the 1st Pathfinders jumped into Normandy. These elite troops were tasked with marking drop zones for the main airborne assault. Within hours, thousands of paratroopers followed, but almost immediately the operations descended into chaos. The pilots, many flying in combat for the first time, faced poor visibility, heavy clouds, and German anti-aircraft fire. They scattered, dropping paratroopers far from their intended drop zones. Men landed in flooded fields that Rommel had deliberately inundated. Weighed down with equipment, many drowned before they could free themselves from their parachutes. Others landed in trees, on buildings, or directly in the midst of German positions. Units were scattered across the Norman countryside, with officers and men separated from their commands. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had one of the most famous experiences of the night. He landed on the church steeple in the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, his parachute catching on the building. He hung there, playing dead, as a firefight raged in the town square below. Germans had spotted the American paratroopers descending and were shooting them as they landed. Steele survived only because a German patrol eventually cut him down and took him prisoner. He would later escape. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, the airborne assault achieved many of its objectives. The scattered nature of the drops actually confused the Germans, who received reports of paratroopers landing across a wide area and couldn't determine where the main threat was. Small groups of American paratroopers, often led by junior officers or even enlisted men who took charge in the absence of their commanders, began to coalesce and attack German positions. One of the most crucial objectives was the capture of the causeway exits behind Utah Beach. These narrow roads running through the flooded lowlands were the only routes off the beach, and if the Germans held them, the troops landing at Utah would be trapped. Elements of the 101st Airborne, led by officers like Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, fought vicious close-quarters battles through the night to secure these vital routes. On the eastern flank, the British 6th Airborne had equally critical objectives. They had to capture intact the bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, which would allow Allied reinforcements to cross, while simultaneously destroying bridges farther east to prevent German counterattacks. The mission to capture the Caen Canal Bridge, later known as Pegasus Bridge, was assigned to a glider-borne force led by Major John Howard. In one of the most remarkable feats of the entire invasion, 3 gliders landed within yards of the bridge at approximately 16 minutes past midnight. Howard's men stormed the bridge in a brief violent action, overwhelming the surprised German defenders. Within minutes, they had secured the bridge intact. When they radioed their success with the code words ham and jam, it was the first objective of D-Day to be achieved. While the paratroopers and glider troops fought in the darkness, the massive invasion fleet was crossing the channel. On board the ships, thousands of young men, many of whom had never seen combat, tried to rest or write last letters home. Chaplains held services. Some men joked nervously. Others were silent, lost in their own thoughts. Many were miserably seasick from the rough seas. Among them was 19-year-old Private Harold Baumgarten of the 29th Infantry Division, assigned to Omaha Beach. He would later recall the journey across the channel. "We were packed in like sardines. The smell of vomit was everywhere. You could hear guys praying. Some were crying. I remember thinking this was really it. Everything we'd trained for. I wondered if I'd see the sunset." As dawn approached, the naval bombardment began. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire at the German coastal defenses. The sound was beyond description. a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard in England 20 miles away. Thousands of shells screamed overhead, slamming into German bunkers, gun positions, and beach obstacles. To the soldiers waiting in the landing craft, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such a bombardment. But they were wrong. The German bunkers were built of reinforced concrete, many 10 feet thick. Most of the shells, fired from miles offshore in the darkness and rough seas, missed their targets. At Omaha Beach in particular, the bombardment barely scratched the German defenses. The commanders who had assured the infantry that the enemy positions would be destroyed before they landed had been far too optimistic. As the gray dawn of June 6th broke over the Normandy coast, the first wave of landing craft began their final run to the beaches. This was it, the moment that would determine the fate of millions, the course of the war, and the future of Europe. At 0630, the first American troops touched down on Utah Beach. 5 minutes later, the Canadians hit Juneau. At 0635, the British began landing at Golden Sword. And at 0640, the first wave reached Omaha Beach, where they would encounter the most deadly opposition of the day. Let's start with Utah Beach, the westernmost landing site. Utah was actually a last-minute addition to the invasion plan, added after Eisenhower expanded the landing area. The assault was carried out by the 4th Infantry Division, and due to a navigational error caused by strong currents, they landed nearly a mile south of their intended beach. This turned out to be extraordinarily lucky. The defenses where they actually landed were weaker than at the planned location. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the 56-year-old son of President Theodore Roosevelt, was the assistant division commander and the only general to land with the first wave. Despite having a heart condition and arthritis so severe that he walked with a cane, Roosevelt had insisted on going in with his men. When he realized they'd landed in the wrong place, he made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Instead of trying to redirect follow-up waves to the planned beach, he declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Roosevelt's decision was brilliant. The troops began moving inland along the causeways that the paratroopers had fought all night to secure. Resistance, while present, was lighter than expected. By the end of the day, Utah Beach was the most successful of all the landings. 23,000 men came ashore with only 197 casualties. It could have been much worse. It certainly was elsewhere. Move east to Omaha Beach, and the story was dramatically different. Omaha would become the bloodiest beach on D-Day. And for the men landing there, it must have seemed like the gates of hell had opened. The plan for Omaha had called for an intensive naval and air bombardment to destroy the German defenses, followed by specialized tanks, called DD tanks, which were amphibious Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens. These tanks were supposed to reach the beach ahead of the infantry to provide covering fire. Then engineers would blow gaps in the German obstacles, allowing subsequent waves to come ashore safely. Almost none of this went according to plan. The air bombardment, conducted in the pre-dawn darkness through heavy clouds, completely missed the beach defenses. The bombs fell harmlessly inland. The naval bombardment, while intensive, failed to knock out most of the fortified German positions. Then, tragically, 27 of the 32 DD tanks launched offshore sank in the rough seas, drowning their crews. Only 5 made it to the beach. The 1st Infantry Wave, men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, landed at 0640. The ramps of the landing craft dropped, and the men stepped into a nightmare. The Germans, far from being suppressed, were waiting. The soldiers faced the 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had been transferred from the Eastern Front. These were experienced troops, and they knew their business. The beach was unlike any of the others. Omaha was shaped like a natural amphitheater, with steep bluffs rising 150 feet above the beach. German positions on these bluffs had perfect fields of fire across the entire beach. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces zeroed in on the waterline began firing. Men were cut down the moment the ramps dropped. Some landing craft hit underwater obstacles and sank. Others landed directly in front of German strongpoints and were torn apart by machine gun fire. Soldiers jumped into water over their heads and drowned. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down in what would later be called murder zones. The beach obstacles, which were supposed to have been cleared by engineers, were still largely intact. The engineers took horrific casualties trying to do their jobs under withering fire. Private Harold Baumgarten, who had crossed the channel, wondering if he'd see sunset, was in the first wave at Omaha. Years later, he described what he saw. The ramp went down and the Germans just opened up. The lieutenant in front of me was hit and fell back on me. I pushed past him into the water. Men all around me were being hit. The water was red with blood. I saw a man with his arm blown off trying to swim with one arm. I saw men with their intestines hanging out. The noise was indescribable, just a constant roar of explosions and machine gun fire. All along Omaha Beach, similar scenes played out. Units landed in the wrong places. Officers were killed, leaving enlisted men to take charge. Equipment was lost. The carefully planned assault had disintegrated into chaos. Some units took 70%. Casualties in the first minutes. Men huddled behind beach obstacles or the few disabled tanks that had made it ashore, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat back into the water. For several hours, the situation at Omaha hung in the balance. The beach was littered with dead and wounded. Landing craft were burning. Vehicles and equipment were strewn across the sand. Some junior officers and commanders offshore began to consider evacuating the beach. The invasion, at least at Omaha, seemed to be failing. But then, gradually, small groups of men began to move. There was no grand coordinated assault, no dramatic moment of decision. Instead, individual soldiers and small units, led by sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, began working their way off the beach. They found draws and gullies leading up the bluffs. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in barbed wire. They suppressed German positions with rifle and machine gun fire. Destroyers from the naval force, seeing the desperate situation on the beach, made a decision that violated their orders but saved the day. They came dangerously close to shore, so close they risked running aground, and began firing directly at German positions on the bluffs. The accurate naval gunfire finally began silencing the German guns that had been slaughtering the infantry. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began to gain toeholds on the bluffs. By midday, they had penetrated the German defenses in several places. By evening, they held a precarious beachhead about a mile deep. But the cost had been terrible. More than 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing at Omaha Beach. It was the closest the invasion came to failure. Let's now move to the British and Canadian beaches in the center and east of the invasion area. Gold Beach was assaulted by the British 50th Infantry Division. The landings began at 0725, nearly an hour after the American beaches, because the tide there reached the right level later. This actually worked in the British favor, as it meant more daylight for the naval bombardment. The British also had a significant advantage in specialized armor. Under Major General Percy Hobart, the British had developed a whole range of modified tanks designed for specific tasks. These Hobart's funnies, as they were affectionately called, included tanks that could lay bridges, tanks fitted with flamethrowers, and tanks with large drums that would beat the ground to detonate mines. At Gold Beach, these specialized vehicles proved their worth, helping clear obstacles and suppress German positions. The fighting at Gold was intense but not as desperate as at Omaha. The German defenders, primarily the 716th Infantry Division, fought stubbornly, but they were not the same quality as the troops at Omaha. The British veterans of North Africa and other campaigns knew their business. They moved quickly off the beach, advancing inland toward their objectives. One of the most important targets on Gold Beach was the coastal battery at Longues-sur-Mer, which could fire on both Gold and Omaha beaches. British commandos and infantry fought their way to the position, eventually forcing its surrender. By the end of D-Day, the British at Gold Beach had penetrated 6 miles inland, farther than any other Allied force that day, though they had failed to capture their ultimate objective of the city of Bayeux. At Juno Beach, assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, presented unique challenges. The beach was defended by strong concrete emplacements, and offshore reefs meant the Canadians had to land at higher tide than planned. This left less beach for the troops to cross, but also meant many of the German obstacles were still underwater, hidden beneath the waves. The Canadians, many of whom were going into combat for the first time, landed at 0745. They immediately ran into heavy fire. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifle Regiment, landing on the western part of Juneau, took serious casualties. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, landing in the center, suffered even worse. B Company of the Queen's Own lost half its men in the first few minutes. But the Canadians pressed forward with determination. Like the British, they had been offered Hobart's funnies, though they had fewer of them than at Gold Beach. Still, the specialized armor helped, particularly the flail tanks that cleared paths through minefields. Canadian engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles and blow gaps in beach defenses. By mid-morning, the Canadians had fought their way off the beach and were pushing inland. They faced continued resistance from German strongpoints and counterattacks, but they kept moving. The Regina Rifles and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles linked up with the British forces from Gold Beach on their right flank. The Queen's Own Rifles and the North Shore Regiment drove toward their objectives inland. Of all the beaches, Juneau saw some of the highest casualty rates in the first wave, with nearly 50% casualties in some companies. By day's end, the Canadians had suffered 340 killed and 574 wounded. But they had advanced farther inland than the Americans at Utah or Omaha, and they had linked up with British forces, creating a continuous lodgment along the coast. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing site, was crucial because it was closest to the city of Caen, a major objective that Montgomery had hoped to capture on D-Day itself. The assault was carried out by the British 3rd Infantry Division, supported by commandos and the 1st Special Service Brigade, which included French commandos who were finally returning to their homeland after 4 years of occupation. The landings at Sword began at 07:25. The initial opposition was moderate, and the British forces, veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Italy, moved efficiently off the beach. Lord Lovat's commandos, who had famously been piped ashore by Piper Bill Millen, playing his bagpipes despite being under fire, pushed inland to link up with the British 6th Airborne Division, holding the bridges captured during the night. The link-up at Pegasus Bridge occurred around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a moment of immense relief for Major John Howard and his men, who had been holding the bridge for nearly 13 hours against German counterattacks. The arrival of Lovat's commandos meant the eastern flank was secure, but Sword Beach also witnessed what could have been a disaster. At approximately 09:30, the leading elements of the British 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack. This was exactly what Rommel had hoped for, exactly what he had argued should happen, hitting the invaders before they could establish themselves. The panzers drove toward the coast between Sword and Juneau beaches, threatening to cut the British forces in two. For a brief moment, a handful of German tanks actually reached the beach. They could see the vast invasion fleet offshore. It was a stunning achievement, but it was also the high water mark of the German counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division was unsupported. No other German units had been released to join the counterattack because Hitler was still asleep, and no one dared wake him to authorize the use of the panzer reserves. The German tanks, exposed and without infantry support, were subjected to devastating fire from British anti-tank guns, naval gunfire, and increasingly, Allied aircraft. An evening glider landing, bringing in reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne, was mistaken by the German commanders for another paratrooper assault in their rear. Concerned about being cut off, the 21st Panzer Division withdrew. The moment of danger had passed. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had accomplished their primary objective. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. 156,000 men were ashore, though they held a lodgment smaller than planned and had failed to capture several key objectives, particularly Caen. The cost had been significant, but less than many planners had feared. Allied casualties for the day were approximately 10,000, with 4,000 confirmed dead. The bloodiest fighting had been at Omaha, but even there, the beach was secure. For the Germans, D-Day was a disaster, though it would take time for the full magnitude to sink in. The Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable barrier, had been breached in a single day. German commanders had been caught flat-footed, uncertain where the main attack was coming, unable to coordinate an effective response. The deception operations had worked perfectly. Even after the Normandy landings, Hitler and the German High Command remained convinced for weeks that the real invasion would still come at Pas de Calais. Entire German armies sat idle in the wrong place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Rommel himself had not even been in France on June 6th. Convinced that the weather was too poor for an invasion, he had left on June 5th to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday, and to petition Hitler for more resources. He didn't learn of the invasion until mid-morning, and it took him all day to return to his headquarters. His absence at the critical moment symbolized the German confusion and lack of coordination. That first night in Normandy, as the Allied soldiers dug foxholes and established defensive positions, many must have reflected on what they had endured. They had survived one of the most intense days of combat in history. They had crossed the Channel, stormed fortified beaches under withering fire, and carved out a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. But they also knew that D-Day, as costly as it had been, was just the beginning. The battle for Normandy was far from over. The German army, for all its initial confusion, was far from beaten. In the days ahead, some of the finest and most fanatical units in the German military would arrive in Normandy. The fighting would become a brutal slog through the Norman hedgerow country, where every field was a potential battlefield and every stone farmhouse a potential fortress. The casualties would mount. The optimistic predictions that the Allies might reach Paris within weeks would prove laughably premature. But June 6, 1944, had fundamentally changed the war. The Allies had returned to continental Europe. The liberation of France, and eventually Western Europe, had begun. The second front that Stalin had demanded was now open. Germany was now truly fighting a two-front war, and despite the fanatical resistance that would continue, despite the months of hard fighting still ahead, the ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt. Let's take a deeper look now at some of the individual stories from D-Day, because beyond the strategic overview, beyond the statistics and the grand sweep of history, Operation Overlord was a collection of hundreds of thousands of individual experiences, acts of courage, moments of terror, and split-second decisions that collectively determined the outcome. Consider the medics who landed with the first waves. These men were supposed to be non-combatants, protected by the Geneva Conventions, marked with red crosses. In practice, on beaches swept by machine gun fire, there was no such thing as a non-combatant. Medics like Private Charles Shea of the 1st Infantry Division, a Penobscot Indian from Maine, waded ashore at Omaha Beach and immediately began pulling wounded men from the water. Shea spent hours in the killing zone, dragging men to whatever cover he could find, administering morphine, stopping bleeding, trying to save lives in the midst of chaos. He survived D-Day, and more than 70 years later, he would return to Normandy for anniversary commemorations, a living, linked to that terrible day. Or think about the combat engineers, who had perhaps the most dangerous job on the beaches. They were tasked with clearing obstacles and mines under direct fire. The casualties among engineer units were staggering. At Omaha Beach, entire engineer teams were wiped out in minutes. But the survivors kept working. They used explosives to blast gaps in the beach obstacles. They marked safe lanes through minefields. They cleared barbed wire and destroyed German fortifications. Without their work, the infantry and vehicles following them would have been trapped on the beaches. Then there were the Rangers. The U.S. Army Rangers, elite light infantry trained for special operations, were given some of the most difficult objectives on D-Day. The most famous of these was the assault on Pointe du Hoc, a 100-foot-tall cliff between Utah and Omaha beaches. German intelligence indicated that this position held a battery of powerful guns that could fire on both beaches. If those guns remained operational, they could devastate the invasion fleet and the troops coming ashore. The mission to neutralize Pointe du Hoc was assigned to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. 225 Rangers would scale the cliffs using ropes, ladders, and grappling hooks borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, all while under fire from above. It was a near-suicidal mission, and everyone involved knew it. The Rangers launched their assault at 0708, over 30 minutes late because strong currents had pushed their landing craft off course. As they approached the cliffs, German soldiers appeared at the top and began dropping grenades and firing down at the Rangers. Some Germans cut the climbing ropes. The landing craft carrying the Rangers came under machine gun fire. Men were hit before they even reached the beach. But the Rangers, true to their training and their motto, "Rangers lead the way," began climbing. They fired their weapons one-handed while pulling themselves up the ropes with the other. Some climbed extension ladders that swayed precariously against the cliff face. German grenades exploded around them. Comrades fell, plummeting back down the cliff to the beach below. But the Rangers kept climbing. Within 15 minutes, the first Rangers reached the top of the cliff. They immediately began clearing German positions with grenades, rifles, and close-quarters combat. More Rangers followed. They secured the position and prepared to destroy the guns. But when they reached the gun emplacements, they made a shocking discovery. The guns weren't there. The Germans had moved them, possibly fearing the guns at their original position would be destroyed by naval bombardment before the invasion. a patrol led by Sergeant Leonard Lomell went inland to search for the guns. About a mile from the coast, hidden in an orchard behind hedgerows, they found them. The guns were unmanned, but ready to fire, ammunition stacked nearby, telephone wires connecting them to forward observers. Lomell and his fellow Rangers destroyed the firing mechanisms using thermite grenades. The battery that could have wreaked havoc on the invasion fleet would never fire a shot. Meanwhile, back at Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers were under siege. The main Ranger force that was supposed to reinforce them had been diverted to Omaha Beach because the delay in taking Pointe du Hoc made commanders think the assault had failed. Rudder and his men, now numbering less than 100 effectives, held their position on the clifftop against repeated German counterattacks. They fought for 2 days, isolated and low on ammunition, before they were finally relieved. Of the 225 Rangers who had climbed the cliffs, only 90 could still fight. The story of Pointe du Hoc exemplifies both the courage of the individual soldiers and the chaos and confusion that characterized D-Day. The mission succeeded, but not in the way anyone had planned. The guns were destroyed, but not where anyone expected them to be. The Rangers held their position, but at a cost that decimated the battalion. Now, let's talk about the airborne operations in more detail, because while the beach landings dominated the narrative of D-Day, the paratroopers and glider troops who landed hours earlier fought their own desperate battles in the darkness. Private John Fitzgerald of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne, jumped over Normandy in the early hours of June 6th. His plane had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and was burning. Men were jumping out wherever they could. Fitzgerald landed hard in a tree and hung there, suspended by his parachute, for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. He couldn't see anything in the darkness. He could hear German voices below. Eventually, Fitzgerald cut himself free and dropped to the ground. He had no idea where he was. His weapon was lost, dropped somewhere during his descent. He was alone in enemy territory with only his knife and his wits. This was the situation thousands of paratroopers found themselves in on D-Day. The operation had scattered them across the Norman countryside like seeds in the wind. But the paratroopers had trained for this possibility. They had been taught to operate independently, to complete the mission even if separated from their units. They used small metal clickers that made a distinctive sound, the cricket, that would allow them to identify friend from foe in the darkness. The challenge and password for the night was flash and thunder. In the darkness, you'd hear the click-click of a cricket, then a voice whispering, "Flash!" And if the answer was thunder, you knew you'd found a friend. Small groups of paratroopers came together and began moving toward their objectives. Leadership fell to whoever was present. A private might lead a group that included a major if the private knew where they were and the major didn't. Sergeants commanded companies, lieutenants led battalions. The rigid hierarchy of the peacetime army dissolved in the chaos of combat, replaced by a more organic leadership structure based on competence and immediate necessity. These small groups of paratroopers became a nightmare for the Germans. They appeared everywhere, cutting communications lines, ambushing patrols, setting up roadblocks, attacking command posts. The Germans couldn't determine where the main American airborne force was because there was no main force. There were hundreds of small groups operating independently, creating chaos throughout the German rear areas. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the 101st Airborne, led one of the most successful small unit actions of D-Day. Winters, who would later gain fame through the book and television series Band of Brothers, found himself commanding a scratch force of only a dozen men. They received orders to eliminate a German artillery battery that was firing on Utah Beach. Winters conducted a hasty reconnaissance, planned a quick assault, and led his men in an attack on a numerically superior German force occupying fortified positions. Through a combination of fire and movement, surprise, and aggressive action, Winters and his men overran the position, killed or scattered the German defenders, and destroyed the guns. It was a textbook small unit infantry assault, executed under combat conditions by men who had never fought together before. For his actions, Winters was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The British airborne operations on the eastern flank had their own dramatic moments. After the successful capture of Pegasus Bridge by Major John Howard's glider-borne force, The paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division landed to reinforce them and complete other objectives. One of these was the destruction of the Merville Battery, a coastal gun position that could fire on Sword Beach. The mission to destroy the Merville Battery was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Terrence Otway and the 9th Parachute Battalion. The plan called for a carefully coordinated assault involving pathfinders, a main parachute drop, a glider assault, and heavy bombers softening up the target. Like so many plans on D-Day, it fell apart almost immediately. The pathfinders were scattered. The main drop was dispersed across miles of countryside. Otway, who had planned to attack with a force of 600 men, found himself at the rendezvous point with only 150. Much of his heavy equipment, including anti-tank guns and mine-clearing equipment, was lost. He was supposed to wait for a glider carrying troops and a flamethrower to crash land directly onto the battery, but time was running out. If the battery wasn't silenced before dawn, it would be able to fire. On the invasion fleet, Otway made the decision to attack with what he had. His men cut through barbed wire and crossed minefields, taking casualties from mines and German fire. They breached the perimeter and engaged in savage close quarters, fighting inside the fortified position. The Germans defending the battery fought tenaciously. It was hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, knives, and grenades in confined spaces. Eventually, the British paratroopers overwhelmed the defenders and destroyed the guns, though they discovered, like the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, that the guns were smaller caliber than intelligence had indicated. Still, the mission was accomplished. The battery was neutralized, but Otway's battalion had been decimated. Of the 150 men who made the assault, only 75 were still able to fight. These airborne operations, chaotic and costly as they were, achieved their strategic purpose. They secured the flanks of the beach landings. They prevented German reinforcements from reaching the coast quickly. They created confusion and disruption in the German rear areas. And they demonstrated the courage and initiative of the individual soldiers who, often lost, separated from their units, and facing overwhelming odds, nevertheless completed their missions. As dawn broke on June 6th and the beach landings began, the men fighting inland could hear the naval bombardment, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the earth. They knew their comrades were hitting the beaches. Some airborne units fought their way toward the coast to link up with the seaborne forces. Others continued attacking German positions inland, preparing the way for the breakout that would, hopefully, come in the days ahead. The naval component of D-Day, Operation Neptune, was a staggering achievement in its own right. Never before or since has such a fleet been assembled. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft of all types, from massive battleships displacing tens of thousands of tons to small landing craft carrying a single squad of infantry, participated in the operation. Coordinating this vast armada required intricate planning and split-second timing. The warships providing fire support included 7 battleships, 2 of which were American and the rest British, along with 23 cruisers and over 100 destroyers. The battleships carried guns that could hurl shells weighing over a ton more than 20 miles inland. Their broadside salvos were earth-shattering events, the muzzle blasts so powerful they could injure personnel on deck who weren't properly protected. The USS Texas, a battleship that had served in World War I and had been called out of semi-retirement for D-Day, fired hundreds of rounds on June 6th, supporting troops at Omaha Beach and Pointe du Hoc. Her guns fired so many shells that the rifling in the barrels began to wear out. At one point, to increase the range of her guns to hit targets farther inland, the Texas deliberately flooded some of her ballast tanks to list the ship, raising the angle of her guns. It was an extraordinary improvisation. The destroyers, smaller and more maneuverable than the battleships, proved invaluable, particularly at Omaha Beach. When the situation there became desperate, destroyer commanders made the decision to close with the shore, bringing their ships within 1,000 yards of the beach, so close they were nearly running aground. From this point-blank range, they could fire directly at German positions with devastating accuracy. The destroyer McCook fired so many rounds that she exhausted her ammunition and had to withdraw to reload. The Carmick, Doyle, Emmons, and others put themselves in harm's way, facing potential destruction from German coastal batteries, to save the infantry pinned on the beach. Admiral Alan Kirk, commander of the Western Naval Task Force supporting the American beaches, later called the destroyers the real heroes of Omaha Beach. Without their close-in fire support, the assault might truly have failed. But the naval forces weren't just about firepower. The vast majority of the ships involved in Neptune were transports and landing craft, vessels designed to carry men, vehicles, and supplies from England to France. The logistics of this operation were mind-boggling. The invasion force included not just combat troops, but also vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, fuel, and thousands of other items necessary to sustain an army in the field. The landing craft themselves ranged from small LCVP, landing craft vehicle and personnel, which could carry 36 men or a vehicle, to massive LST, landing ship tank, which could carry 60 vehicles and hundreds of tons of cargo. The LCVP, designed by Andrew Higgins, and known as the Higgins boat, was so crucial to the invasion that Eisenhower later called it one of the tools that won the war. Over 20,000 were built during the conflict. The coxswains who piloted these landing craft had one of the most dangerous jobs in the Navy. They had to navigate through mine-infested waters, avoid underwater obstacles, time their approach to hit the beach at the right moment relative to the tide, and do all this while under fire. Once they dropped their ramps and discharged their troops or cargo, they had to reverse off the beach and head back out to sea to pick up another load. Many didn't make it. Landing craft were sunk by mines, hit by artillery, or swamped by the rough seas. For the sailors on the capital ships, the battleships and cruisers, D-Day was a day of constant action. Gun crews worked around the clock, loading and firing until their ears rang and their muscles ached. Below decks, engineers kept the boilers running and the engines turning. Damage control parties stood ready to respond to fires or flooding if the ship was hit. Medical personnel prepared to treat casualties, both from the ship's crew and from wounded soldiers who might be evacuated to larger vessels. The minesweepers had begun their work days before D-Day, clearing lanes through the German minefields in the Channel. This was nerve-wracking, dangerous work. A mine could sink a minesweeper with a single detonation. But the channels had to be clear for the invasion fleet. The minesweeper crews worked methodically, sweeping back and forth, detonating or disabling mines, marking safe channels with buoys. Even after the beaches were secured, the naval forces continued their work. They brought in follow-on waves of troops. They delivered supplies. They provided fire support for troops fighting inland, responding to requests from shore fire control parties. They defended against German submarines and aircraft. The naval campaign in support of Overlord would continue for weeks, an often overlooked but absolutely essential component of the invasion's success. The air campaign over Normandy on D-Day was equally critical. Allied air superiority was total. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was conspicuous by its absence. Only 2 German fighters managed to strafe the beaches on D-Day, and they were quickly shot down. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that no Allied plane would ever bomb German soil. By 1944, that boast was a bitter joke, and on D-Day, the skies over Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. More than 11,000 Allied aircraft participated in D-Day operations. Bombers had struck German positions, transportation networks, and radar stations in the hours and days before the invasion. Fighters flew cover over the invasion fleet and the beaches. Fighter bombers attacked German reinforcements, attempting to reach the battlefield. Transport aircraft carried the paratroopers and towed the gliders. It was the largest air operation in history up to that point. The bomber campaign before D-Day had been intense and controversial. The strategic bombers of the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command, which had been pounding German cities and industrial targets, were redirected to support the invasion. They attacked railway junctions, bridges, and roads across France and Belgium, aiming to isolate Normandy and prevent the Germans from bringing in reinforcements quickly. This transportation plan, as it was called, was effective but costly for French civilians. The bombers couldn't always hit their targets with precision, and many French people died in these raids. It was one of the bitter ironies of liberation that it came at such a cost to the people being liberated. Allied commanders were aware of this, and it weighed on them, but they judged the destruction necessary to ensure the invasion's success. On D-Day itself, the bombers struck at targets behind the beaches. Unfortunately, at Omaha Beach, the bombers released their payloads too late due to concerns about hitting their own troops, and the Bombs fell harmlessly inland. At Utah, the bombing was more effective. But overall, the hope that the aerial bombardment would devastate German defenses proved overly optimistic. The bunkers were too strong, and bombing from altitude in poor weather was not accurate enough. The fighter and fighter-bomber pilots had more success. They strafed German positions, attacked vehicles on the roads, and engaged any German aircraft that dared to show themselves. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, an American fighter ace flying with a British Spitfire squadron, shot down 2 German fighters over the invasion beaches. Dozens of other pilots scored kills that day. The few Luftwaffe pilots brave or foolish enough to attack the invasion fleet were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The transport aircraft pilots, flying the lumbering C-47s and their British equivalents, faced a different challenge. They had to fly in tight formations through darkness, clouds, and anti-aircraft fire to deliver their paratroopers over the drop zones. Many of these pilots were young and inexperienced. When they encountered the unexpectedly heavy German Flak, some panicked, speeding up, slowing down, or taking evasive action. This scattered the paratroopers even more than the wind and clouds had already done. But these same pilots would return night after night in the days following D-Day, bringing in supplies and reinforcements. They flew unarmed transports over hostile territory, facing German fighters and anti-aircraft fire to keep the invasion force supplied. Many never received recognition for their bravery, but without them, the invasion could not have succeeded. The glider pilots had perhaps the worst job of all. Gliders were flimsy aircraft made of wood and canvas, with no engines, no weapons, no armor. Once released from their tow aircraft, they glided to Earth, and the pilot's job was to land in often tiny fields, at night, without power, and preferably without killing everyone aboard. The landing itself was barely controlled. Gliders smashed into hedgerows, crashed into buildings, broke apart on landing. Casualties among glider troops were high, and the pilots themselves were expected to then fight as infantry after landing. Sergeant Stan Hollis of the British Green Howards Regiment was the only man to be awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor, for actions on D-Day itself. Hollis landed on Gold Beach and almost immediately began displaying the kind of courage that would earn him the medal. When his company came under fire from a German pillbox, Hollis charged it alone, throwing grenades through the firing slit and killing the occupants. Later, he single-handedly assaulted a German position to save a reconnaissance patrol that had walked into an ambush. By the end of the day, Hollis had killed numerous enemy soldiers, destroyed multiple positions, and saved the lives of many of his comrades. Stories like Hollis's were repeated across Normandy, though not all were recognized with medals. Countless acts of individual bravery occurred that day, most witnessed only by the few men who fought alongside the heroes. A private who charged a machine gun nest to save his pinned-down squad. A sergeant who held a position against overwhelming odds to cover his platoon's withdrawal. A lieutenant who led his men off a beach when all the officers above him were dead or wounded. These men didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were doing their jobs, trying to survive, trying to help their buddies survive. The German perspective on D-Day has received less attention in popular accounts, but it's worth considering. For the German soldiers defending the Atlantic Wall, D-Day was equally terrifying. They had spent months or years building fortifications, laying mines, preparing to repel an invasion they knew was coming. But nothing could fully prepare them for the reality. Many of the German troops in Normandy were not the elite forces of popular imagination. While there were veteran units like the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach and the 21st Panzer Division inland from the beaches, many defenders were Ost battalions, units composed of captured Soviet soldiers who had been given the choice between serving in the German army or starving in prisoner of war camps. Their loyalty was questionable, their equipment was poor, and their morale was low. But even these reluctant soldiers could be dangerous when fighting from prepared positions. At Omaha Beach, it was largely these so-called inferior troops who inflicted such terrible casualties on the Americans. Given strong fortifications and good fields of fire, even mediocre soldiers can be effective defenders. The German commanders faced an impossible situation. They couldn't be strong everywhere. The Atlantic Wall stretched for thousands of miles. They had to guess where the invasion would come, and they guessed wrong. Even when the landings in Normandy began, they couldn't be sure this was the main effort. The deception operations had worked too well. Entire German armies sat idle, waiting for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais that would never come. The German communication and command structure broke down on D-Day. Allied aircraft had destroyed many telephone lines and radio stations. Commanders couldn't reach their superiors or their subordinates. Orders were delayed or never arrived. The famous German military efficiency faltered in the face of the Allied onslaught. And crucially, Hitler's insistence on personal control of reserves meant that the panzer divisions that might have made a difference couldn't be committed without his approval, and he was asleep for much of the critical period. Some German officers recognized early on that the game was up. They knew that once the Allies had established a beachhead and begun pouring in reinforcements, the Wehrmacht couldn't win. Others remained convinced they could drive the invaders back into the sea if only they could concentrate enough force. Rommel arrived back at his headquarters on the evening of June 6th, and immediately began planning counterattacks. But the counterattacks, when they came, were piecemeal and uncoordinated, easily beaten back by Allied firepower and air superiority. For the individual German soldiers in Normandy, D-Day often meant death or captivity. Some fought to the end, believing in their cause or simply doing their duty. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, relieved to be out of the war. German prisoners were a common sight on the beaches by the afternoon of June 6th, young men sitting under guard, looking shocked and exhausted. Among the German prisoners were the Ost Battalion troops, who often didn't speak German and had no love for their captors, turned captors. There's a famous photograph from D-Day showing a group of prisoners on Juno Beach. Most look like the typical image of German soldiers, young white men in field gray uniforms. But among them are clearly Asian faces, men who had been drafted into the Red Army, captured by the Germans on the Eastern Front, pressed into service, and now captured again by Canadians in France. Their war had taken them across the breadth of Europe and Asia, and they likely had no idea what would happen to them next. As night fell on June 6th, both sides began to assess the results of the longest day. For the Allies, the assessment was mixed but ultimately positive. They were ashore. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Casualties, while heavy, were lower than the worst predictions. Some objectives had been taken, others had not. Caen remained in German hands. The beachheads were not as deep as planned, but the critical thing was that they had a foothold, and more importantly, they had momentum. Over 132,000 troops had landed by sea, and another 23,000 by air. The beaches were being organized. Supply dumps were being established. Engineers were clearing obstacles and building roads. The artificial mulberry harbors were being towed across the channel. Reinforcements were on the way. The Allies were in France to stay. For the Germans, the assessment was grim. The invasion had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall had failed. The Allies had air and naval superiority. German reinforcements were being bombed and strafed as they tried to reach the battlefield. And the reserves, the panzer divisions that might have made a difference, had been committed too late and in too small numbers to change the outcome. But D-Day, momentous as it was just the beginning. The Battle of Normandy would continue for more than 2 months. The fighting would be brutal, a grinding attritional struggle through the Norman hedgerow country. The Allies would suffer tens of thousands more casualties before they finally broke out of Normandy in late July and early August. Paris would not be liberated until late August. The war in Europe would continue until May 1945, another 11 months of fighting. Still, June 6, 1944, was the hinge on which the war turned. It was the day when the Western Allies returned to continental Europe in force. It was the day when Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable barrier, was breached. It was the day when the liberation of Western Europe began. The human cost of that single day was staggering. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers died on June 6th. Thousands more were wounded. Many of those who survived D-Day would die in the weeks and months of fighting that followed. The cemeteries in Normandy, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stretching to the horizon, bear silent testimony to the price of liberation. But it's important to remember that D-Day was not just an American operation, though that's often the impression in popular culture. The British and Canadians landed more troops on D-Day than the Americans did. British and Canadian forces captured more territory on June 6th than the Americans. The naval forces were predominantly British. The air forces were multinational. There were also French commandos, Polish pilots, Norwegian sailors, and troops from many other nations. D-Day was a truly Allied effort, a demonstration of what could be accomplished when the democratic nations of the world worked together toward a common goal. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond World War II. It marked the emergence of the United States as a global military power. It demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations, coordinating air, sea, and land forces toward a common objective. It showed the importance of logistics, intelligence, and deception in modern warfare. The lessons learned on June 6th would influence military thinking for decades to come. For the people of France and the other occupied nations of Western Europe, D-Day was the beginning of liberation. For 4 years, they had lived under Nazi occupation, subject to brutal repression, deportations, and in many cases, collaboration that would leave scars for generations. The arrival of Allied troops meant freedom, but it also meant destruction. Much of Normandy would be devastated by the fighting. Thousands of French civilians died in the battle. Cities like Caen and Saint-Lô were reduced to rubble. The Normans who survived the battle had mixed feelings about their liberation. Yes, they were free from German occupation, but their homes were destroyed, their farms were battlefields. Unexploded ordnance and landmines would make parts of Normandy dangerous for years. The scars of the battle, both physical and psychological, would take decades to heal, but they were free, and that was what mattered. The photographs and film footage from the liberation of French towns and cities in the months after D-Day show the joy and relief of people who had been under occupation. Children running, alongside American tanks. Girls kissing soldiers. People weeping with happiness. Whatever the cost, liberation was worth it. D-Day also marked a turning point in the relationship between America and Europe. The United States had been reluctant to involve itself in European conflicts. After World War I, America had retreated into isolationism. But World War II, and particularly D-Day, forged a bond between America and Western Europe that would last throughout the Cold War and beyond. The American commitment to European security, symbolized by NATO and the continuing presence of American troops in Europe, can be traced directly back to the decision to launch Operation Overlord. For the soldiers who fought on D-Day and survived, the day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke about their experiences, even to their families, the horrors they had witnessed, the friends they had lost, the things they had done and seen were too painful to relive. Only in their final years did many D-Day veterans begin to speak publicly about their experiences, driven by a desire to ensure that younger generations understood the cost of freedom. These veterans, when they did speak, often emphasized not their own heroism, but their desire to honor the friends who didn't come home. They visited the cemeteries in Normandy, weeping at the graves of men they had known as boys, 18 and 19 years old, who had died on a beach in France 80 years ago. They spoke at schools and memorial events, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, trying to convey to audiences who had never experienced war what it was like, what it meant, what it cost. One of the most poignant moments of any D-Day anniversary is when veterans returned to Normandy. Many had not been back since 1944. Seeing the beaches again, now peaceful and covered with vacationers, seeing the memorials and museums, meeting French people who are grateful for their sacrifice, is an emotional experience. Some veterans break down in tears. Others find a measure of peace, seeing that the places where they fought and their friends died are now being cared for and remembered. The memorials and cemeteries in Normandy are maintained with remarkable care. The American cemetery at Omaha Beach, overlooking the beach where so many men died, is a place of profound beauty and sadness. 9,387 American service members are buried there, row upon row of white marble crosses and stars of David. The names of a further 1,557 missing soldiers are inscribed on the walls of the memorial. Walking among those graves, reading the inscriptions, many of which simply say, "Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God," is a powerful reminder of the cost of war. There are British, Canadian, Polish, and German cemeteries in Normandy as well. Each tells a part of the story. The German cemetery at La Cambre is a somber place with dark stone markers instead of white crosses, a reflection of Germany's complicated relationship with its wartime past. Over 21,000 German soldiers are buried there, many of them teenagers who died fighting for an evil regime. They were victims of that regime as well, in their own way, though that doesn't excuse what they fought for. The French people of Normandy have an unusual relationship with D-Day. For them, it's not an abstract historical event. It happened in their backyard. Every town has a story from the battle. Every field might contain a piece of wreckage or an unexploded shell. The older generation remembers the occupation, the battle, the liberation. Younger generations grow up surrounded by the physical remnants of the war. But the Normans have embraced their role as the guardians of D-Day's memory. They maintain the memorials. They welcome veterans and tourists. They've built museums, like the exceptional Caen Memorial Museum, which tells the story of the war, and particularly D-Day, with remarkable depth and nuance. Every year on June 6th, memorial ceremonies are held across Normandy, attended by veterans, dignitaries, and locals. It's a solemn reminder that the past is never really past, that history lives on in the present. The beaches themselves are perhaps the most powerful memorial. You can walk on Omaha Beach today, a beautiful stretch of sand popular with locals and tourists. But if you know where to look, you can still see the remnants of the Atlantic Wall, concrete bunkers now covered in graffiti or filled with sand. You can see Pointe du Hoc, the cliffs that the Rangers scaled, now pockmarked with craters from the naval bombardment, and preserved as they were on June 7, 1944, a lunar landscape of shell holes and destroyed bunkers. Utah Beach, once a scene of chaos and fire, is now a quiet beach with a museum and memorial. Juno Beach has a Canadian visitor center, telling the story of Canada's contribution to D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. Gold and Sword beaches, now part of the continuous stretch of Norman coast, have smaller memorials and museums. Each tells a piece of the story, and together they create a comprehensive picture of what happened on June 6, 1944. The technology of D-Day has also become part of the legacy. The Higgins boats, the D-Day tanks, the Mulberry harbors, all were innovations developed specifically for the invasion. The use of paratroopers on such a massive scale was unprecedented. The coordination of air, sea, and land forces was more complex than anything attempted before. Modern amphibious operations, from the Incheon landing in Korea to more recent actions, all draw on lessons learned on D-Day. The intelligence and deception operations surrounding D-Day have become legendary. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that convinced the Germans the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, was one of the most successful deception operations in military history. The work of codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked the German Enigma codes and provided crucial intelligence on German dispositions and intentions, was equally vital. The entire operation showed the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The planning and logistics of D-Day set new standards for military operations. The ability to transport, supply, and coordinate the actions of millions of men across hundreds of miles of ocean was an achievement that required not just military prowess, but also industrial might and organizational genius. The United States in particular demonstrated its capacity to project power across the globe, a capability that would define the post-war era. But for all the technology, strategy, and planning, D-Day ultimately came down to individual human beings. Young men, most barely out of their teens, wading through surf under machine gun fire, paratroopers landing in the darkness in enemy territory, sailors keeping their ships on station despite the danger, pilots flying into anti-aircraft fire, medics treating wounds under fire, engineers clearing obstacles while being shot at. These individual acts of courage, repeated thousands of times across Normandy on June 6th, were what won the day. Many of those men didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were scared. They wanted to survive. They wanted to go home. But they did their jobs. They fought for their countries, for their comrades, for the cause of freedom. Some made the ultimate sacrifice. Others carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. All of them played a part in one of the most significant days in human history. The strategic impact of D-Day on the broader war cannot be overstated. Prior to June 6th, the war in Europe was primarily an Eastern Front affair, with the Soviet Union bearing the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany. The opening of the Second Front in Normandy forced Germany to fight a true two-front war, dividing their forces and their attention. German divisions that might have been sent to fight the Soviets had to be kept in the West to face the Anglo-American Canadian armies. This had significant implications for the post-war settlement. Stalin had been demanding a second front for years. The opening of that front demonstrated Allied commitment to defeating Germany and gave the Western Allies a seat at the table when it came to determining the fate of post-war Europe. Without D-Day and the subsequent liberation of Western Europe by American, British, and Canadian forces, it's possible that Soviet forces might have advanced much farther west, potentially occupying all of Germany and perhaps even France. The Cold War division of Europe was determined in part by where the armies stood when Germany surrendered, and D-Day ensured that Western armies would be present in Western Europe. The impact on Germany's war effort was immediate and severe. By late 1944, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Western Allies were advancing from France and later from Italy. The strategic bombing campaign was devastating German cities and industrial capacity. German forces were stretched thin, unable to concentrate against any single threat. The wonder is not that Germany lost the war, but that it held out as long as it did. Hitler's response to D-Day and the Normandy campaign showed his declining grip on reality. He refused to allow strategic withdrawals, insisting that every piece of ground be held to the last man. This led to German forces being encircled and destroyed in pocket battles like the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. He continued to believe in wonder weapons, the V-rockets and jet aircraft that would turn the tide. He initiated doomed offensives like the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, which achieved initial surprise but ultimately only hastened Germany's defeat by expending resources that could not be replaced. The July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt on Hitler, carried out by German officers who recognized that the war was lost and hoped to negotiate a peace, showed that even within the German military, there was recognition that D-Day had sealed Germany's fate. The plot failed, and Hitler's reprisals against the conspirators were brutal. But the very fact that senior German officers were willing to attempt to kill their own leader demonstrated how dire the situation had become. For the Allied soldiers who survived D-Day, the battle was just beginning. The Norman hedgerow country, a landscape of small fields divided by thick hedges and sunken lanes, proved to be a defender's paradise. The Germans, falling back from the beaches, established defensive lines that were incredibly difficult to break. Every field became a small battlefield. Every hedgerow concealed potential ambushes. The fighting was slow, grinding, and bloody. The Battle of Normandy, from D-Day until the breakout in late July, cost the Allies over 200,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The Germans suffered even more, with their casualties estimated at over 400,000, including 100,000 killed and 200,000 captured. Entire German divisions were destroyed. The cream of the German army in the west was shattered in Normandy. The breakout, when it finally came at the end of July with Operation Cobra, transformed the campaign. American forces punched through the German lines and raced across France. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, was a moment of incredible joy and emotion. The war in Western Europe would continue until May 1945, with hard fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine. But the path from Normandy to the final defeat of Nazi Germany was direct. The political implications of D-Day extended beyond the immediate military situation. The successful invasion vindicated the Allied decision to prioritize the defeat of Germany before focusing resources on the Pacific War against Japan. It demonstrated that the Western democracies, despite their slower mobilization and sometimes fractious command structures, could organize and execute complex military operations. It showed that American industrial might, British experience, and the contributions of smaller Allied nations could be combined into an effective fighting force. The social impact of D-Day and the war in Europe more broadly was profound. The United States military in World War II was segregated, with African American soldiers serving in separate units and often relegated to support roles. But the need for manpower meant that black soldiers did see combat, and their contributions, though often overlooked at the time, were significant. The experience of fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home would fuel the civil rights movement in the post-war years. Women also played crucial roles in D-Day, though they were barred from combat positions. Nurses treated the wounded on hospital ships and in field hospitals just behind the lines, working under incredibly difficult conditions. Women in the various auxiliary services performed vital functions in communications, intelligence, and logistics. The contributions of women to the war effort helped shift perceptions about gender roles and contributed to changes in women's status in the post-war period. The technical innovations of D-Day had lasting impacts. The development of specialized armor, amphibious vehicles, and landing craft changed the nature of amphibious warfare. The coordination of large-scale airborne operations provided lessons that would influence military doctrine for decades. The use of artificial harbors and undersea pipelines showed the importance of logistics in modern warfare. Even the practice of combined arms operations, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, air power, and naval support, became a standard feature of Western military thinking. The propaganda value of D-Day for the Allies was immense. News of the successful landings was broadcast around the world. In occupied Europe, resistance movements were galvanized by the knowledge that liberation was coming. Neutral countries were impressed by the demonstration of Allied power. The psychological impact on Germany was significant, with German civilians beginning to realize that the war was truly lost. The famous speech by Eisenhower, prepared in case the invasion failed, was never delivered. It read, "Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." The fact that this speech was never needed is a testament to the courage of the men who fought on D-Day and the skill of the planners who organized the operation. The personal stories of D-Day veterans are diverse and deeply moving. Consider Frank DeVita, a combat engineer who landed at Omaha Beach. His job was to clear mines and obstacles under fire. He survived the beach, fought through Normandy, was wounded, recovered, and returned to combat. He was part of the liberation of a concentration camp, an experience that haunted him for the rest of his life. He returned to Normandy decades later and broke down in tears on Omaha Beach, overwhelmed by memories. His story is just one of thousands, each unique, each a window into the experience of D-Day. Or consider Madeleine Albright's father, Joseph Korbel, a Czech diplomat who had fled the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia and worked in London during the war. D-Day meant that one day he might be able to return home, that his daughter might grow up in a free Czechoslovakia. Though the Soviet occupation that followed the war meant that freedom was delayed, D-Day represented hope for millions of Europeans living under occupation. The French resistance played a crucial role in D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, though their contribution is sometimes overshadowed by the actions of the regular armies. In the weeks before D-Day, resistance fighters sabotaged railways, cut telephone lines, and attacked German units, helping to slow German reinforcements. On D-Day itself, resistance members provided intelligence and assisted Allied soldiers. In the months after D-Day, they continued to harass German forces, tie down German troops that might otherwise have been used at the front, and assist in the liberation of French towns and cities. The role of intelligence in D-Day cannot be overstated. Beyond the breaking of the Enigma codes, there was also human intelligence from resistance fighters, aerial reconnaissance, and intelligence gathered from captured documents and prisoners. The Allies knew more about German dispositions than the Germans knew about Allied intentions, a crucial advantage. The ability to read German communications meant that the Allies could monitor German responses to the invasion in real time and adjust their plans accordingly. The weather, that crucial factor that almost caused Eisenhower to postpone the invasion indefinitely, turned out to be a double-edged sword. The poor weather on June 6th made conditions difficult for the Allies, particularly for the amphibious operations, but it also convinced the Germans that an invasion was impossible. Rommel felt comfortable enough to leave Normandy. Many German units stood down from high alert. When the invasion came, it achieved a degree of surprise despite the Germans knowing an invasion was coming somewhere. The Great Storm of June 19th to 22nd, 2 weeks after D-Day, nearly undid all the progress the Allies had made. The storm destroyed one of the Mulberry harbors and severely damaged the other. Hundreds of ships and landing craft were wrecked. The supply situation became critical. For several days it seemed possible that the Germans might be able to contain and perhaps even push back the Allied beachhead. But the Allies recovered, repaired what could be repaired, worked around what couldn't, and continued the buildup. The storm was a setback, not a disaster. The lessons of D-Day influenced the Pacific War as well. The techniques developed for amphibious operations in Normandy were applied to island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. The importance of naval gunfire support, specialized armor, and careful planning were all demonstrated on D-Day and applied in battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Though the challenges of tropical islands were different from the beaches of Normandy, the fundamental principles remained the same. The decision not to invade Japan, made possible by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, saved Allied lives, but also meant that the ultimate test of amphibious invasion was never conducted. Planning for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, anticipated casualties that would have dwarfed D-Day. The beaches of Kyushu would have made Omaha look like a training exercise. The fact that this invasion never occurred is something for which both Japanese and Allied descendants can be grateful. The moral questions surrounding D-Day are complex. Was the invasion justified? Almost everyone would agree that defeating Nazi Germany was a moral necessity. The Holocaust, the aggressive wars that Germany had launched, the brutal occupation policies, all made it clear that Hitler's regime had to be defeated. D-Day was a crucial step toward that defeat. The Allied cause was just. But the methods, the strategic bombing that killed French civilians, the destruction of Norman towns and cities, the casualties among young men conscripted from across the Allied nations and forced to storm defended beaches, these raise more difficult questions. War is a terrible thing, and even just wars involve acts that, in isolation, seem horrific. The calculation made by Allied leaders was that the short-term costs, horrible as they were, would lead to a quicker end to the war, and thus save lives in the long run. Whether that calculation was correct is something historians still debate. The German soldiers who fought on D-Day present their own moral complexity. Many were conscripts who had little choice about serving. Many were young men who had been indoctrinated from childhood with Nazi propaganda. Some were true believers in Hitler's ideology. Others were simply doing what they saw as their duty to their country. Some committed atrocities, others fought by the rules of war. It's tempting to paint all German soldiers as either victims or villains, but the reality is more complicated. They fought for an evil regime, but that doesn't mean every individual soldier was evil. There were instances of humanity amid the horror, stories of German medics treating Allied wounded, of surrenders conducted with dignity, of individual Germans who chose not to fire on helpless paratroopers tangled in trees. These stories don't excuse the crimes of the Nazi regime, but they remind us that even in the worst circumstances, individuals can choose compassion over cruelty. The aftermath of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy left physical scars on the landscape that remain to this day. Farmers still occasionally plow up bones, helmets, or unexploded ordnance. In some places, forests that were destroyed by fighting have never fully regrown. Buildings damaged in the fighting still show bullet holes and shrapnel scars. These physical remnants serve as tangible connections to the past, reminders that the events of June 6, 1944, happened in real places to real people. The economic impact of D-Day was significant. The cost of the operation was enormous. The United States alone spent billions of dollars, an astronomical sum in 1940s money. The ships, aircraft, weapons, equipment, and supplies required for D-Day represented a significant portion of Allied industrial output. But the investment paid off. The successful invasion shortened the war, and the sooner the war ended, the sooner resources could be redirected to reconstruction and civilian needs. The post-war economic order, symbolized by institutions like the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, was made possible by the Allied victory that D-Day helped secure. The prosperity of Western Europe in the latter half of the 20th century, the European Union, the long peace between the major European powers, all flow in part from the events of June 6, 1944. D-Day also had a profound impact on military culture and identity. The veterans of D-Day became heroes, their generation celebrated as the greatest generation. Whether this label is fair, whether it diminishes the contributions of other generations, is debatable. But there's no question that the men who fought on D-Day accomplished something extraordinary. They faced death and came through. They liberated Europe. They defeated fascism. Those are real achievements worth honoring. For the families of men who died on D-Day, June 6th is a day of mixed emotions. pride in what their fathers, grandfathers, brothers, or uncles accomplished. Grief for the loss of men they never knew or barely remember. Anger sometimes at a war that took someone precious away. The descendants of D-Day veterans often feel a responsibility to remember and to tell the story. They visit Normandy, they research their relatives' unit, they preserve letters and photographs. They become the keepers of the memory. The educational legacy of D-Day is significant. The invasion is taught in schools around the world as a pivotal moment in history. Museums, documentaries, books, and films have told and retold the story. Each generation discovers D-Day anew and finds in it lessons relevant to their own time. For some, it's a story of heroism and sacrifice. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the horrors of war. For still others, it's a complex narrative about politics, strategy, and the human cost of conflict. The representation of D-Day in popular culture has shaped how many people understand the event. Films like The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan have brought D-Day to vivid life for millions of people who were born long after the war ended. These films, particularly Saving Private Ryan, with its intense and graphic depiction of the Omaha Beach landing, have influenced how people visualize D-Day. For better or worse, for many people, their mental image of D-Day comes from these films rather than from historical sources. This raises questions about the responsibility of filmmakers and other creators when depicting real historical events. Do they have an obligation to be historically accurate? Or is artistic license acceptable in service of telling a compelling story? Films and television shows about D-Day have sometimes prioritized drama over accuracy, creating moments that never happened, changing the sequence of events, or simplifying complex situations. This can mislead audiences, but also can make the story more accessible and emotionally impactful. The video game industry has also tackled D-Day with games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty, allowing players to virtually storm Omaha Beach or parachute into Normandy. This interactive approach to history raises its own questions. Can a video game teach history effectively? Or does it trivialize the real suffering and sacrifice by turning it into entertainment? Different people answer these questions differently, but there's no denying that video games have introduced D-Day to younger generations who might not otherwise engage with history. The photography and film footage from D-Day provides an invaluable historical record. Photographers like Robert Capa, who took iconic images from Omaha Beach, risked their lives to document the invasion. Many of Capa's photographs were damaged in development, but the few that survived capture the chaos and terror of the beach landing with visceral immediacy. Other photographers and combat cameramen documented all aspects of the operation, from the tense moments before the landing to the aftermath. This visual record allows us to see D-Day with our own eyes, to connect with the reality of what happened in a way that words alone cannot convey. The oral histories collected from D-Day veterans in their later years are equally valuable. Projects like the Eisenhower Center's Oral History Collection and the efforts of historians like Stephen Ambrose to interview veterans while they were still alive have preserved first-hand accounts of D-Day that would otherwise be lost. These interviews capture not just the facts of what happened, but also the emotions, the fear, the confusion, the moments of humor, even in horror. They humanize the statistics and bring individual stories to life. As the last D-Day veterans pass away, we are entering a new phase of D-Day memory. Soon there will be no one left who can say, "I was there." The transition from living memory to history is always difficult. It means we lose the ability to ask questions, to hear new stories, to connect personally with those who experienced the event. But it also means that D-Day becomes the province of historians, museums, and educators who must work to keep the memory alive and relevant. The challenges of preserving D-Day memory in the 21st century are significant. How do you make an event from 80 years ago relevant to teenagers today? How do you combat misinformation and simplistic narratives? How do you honor the sacrifice of those who fought without glorifying war? These are questions that museums, teachers, and memorial organizations grapple with constantly. New technologies offer some answers. Virtual reality experiences can allow people to experience D-Day in immersive ways. Digital archives make primary sources available to anyone with an internet connection. Social media can connect people interested in D-Day history across the globe, but technology can also spread myths and misinformation. and the sheer volume of information available can be overwhelming. The continued relevance of D-Day to contemporary issues is sometimes debated. Is D-Day still relevant in an age of cyber warfare and drones? Does the good war narrative of World War II provide lessons for more ambiguous modern conflicts? Can the unity of purpose that characterized the Allied effort in World War II be replicated in our divided modern societies? These are legitimate questions, and they don't have easy answers. But there are enduring lessons from D-Day. The importance of international cooperation in facing existential threats, the necessity of sacrifice in defense of freedom, the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, the human cost of war, and thus the importance of working to prevent conflict. These lessons transcend the specific circumstances of June 6, 1944, and remain relevant today. D-Day also reminds us of what can be accomplished when democracies work together. The Allied coalition that planned and executed Operation Overlord brought together nations with different languages, cultures, and military traditions. They had disagreements, sometimes bitter ones, about strategy and command, but they set aside those differences in pursuit of a common goal. In our modern world, where international cooperation often seems impossible, D-Day stands as proof that it can be done when the stakes are high enough. The story of D-Day is ultimately a human story. It's about young men, most barely out of their teens, facing the most intense and terrifying experiences imaginable. It's about their courage, their fear, their camaraderie, their loss. It's about families at home, waiting anxiously for news. It's about the civilians caught in the middle, suffering through occupation and liberation. It's about commanders making decisions that would affect the lives of millions. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As we look back on D-Day 80 years later, we see an event that changed the course of history. The invasion of Normandy set in motion the chain of events that led to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the liberation of Europe, and the end of World War II. It shaped the post-war world in profound ways. The world we live in today is fundamentally different because of what happened on June 6, 1944. But we also see a profoundly human event. We see young men wading through bloody water toward a beach swept by machine gun fire. We see paratroopers hanging from trees in the darkness. We see medics treating wounded under fire. We see sailors keeping their ships on station despite danger. We see families receiving telegrams informing them of losses. We see the grief, the courage, the sacrifice. D-Day reminds us that history is not an abstract collection of dates and facts. It's made by real people making real choices, often in the most difficult circumstances. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy were not superheroes. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because they believed they had to, because their friends were beside them, because they had a job to do. Many D-Day veterans, when asked if they were heroes, would deny it. They'd say the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. They'd say they were just doing their job. They'd say they were lucky to survive. This humility, this reluctance to claim heroism, is itself a mark of their character. They understood the cost of war. They knew that there was nothing glorious about combat, even in a just cause. The final thought to leave you with is this: D-Day was a pivotal moment in human history, but it was also a tragedy. Thousands of young men died on June 6, 1944. Thousands more were wounded. The survivors carried scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. The victory achieved on D-Day was necessary. It was just. It was worth the cost. But it was a terrible cost nonetheless. As we remember D-Day, we should honor the sacrifice of those who fought. We should celebrate the victory over fascism, and we should commit ourselves to working for a world where such sacrifices are never again necessary. We should remember that war, even just war, is hell, and that the goal should always be to prevent it. And we should never forget the individual stories, the human beings behind the statistics, the men who fought on the longest day and changed the course of history. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Normandy invasion. Operation Overlord. By any name, it stands as one of the most significant days in human history, a day when courage, sacrifice, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds achieved the seemingly impossible. 156,000 men crossed the English Channel that day. 4,000 would never return. Those who did would never forget, and neither should we.